It's remake time once again. Today we're revisiting Gliscor and Gligar, which we originally explored in our video released on February 25th, 2018. But both flying scorpions have had such an absolutely righteous competitive history, whose great strength and controversy merit in-depth re-examination. There's a lot to get into for both Pokemon, so without further ado, we're asking the question, how great were Gligar and Gliscor actually? Ground flying is amazing typing, but Gligar didn't pack the stats nor the move pool to utilize it in its debut generation's OU, lacking in offense, bulk, and utility alike. There was nothing it could do that was particularly notable and couldn't be done much better by better Pokemon. Gligar did counter Heracross, but so did, Skarmory. The closest thing Gligar had a niche was switching into Raikou's Thunder, then utilizing its 76.9% chance to survive Hidden Power Ice at full health to bounce it back for a KO with counter, which worked against all Hidden Powers in Gen 2 and 3. Of course, this was just about the least reliable strategy ever, needing Gligar to come in safely, be at full health, and rely on a damage roll, and the opponent having no idea what it was going to do, which wouldn't work at all consistently against anyone competent, leaving it only to be used by players who had gotten bored with the game and needed to inject some danger in life, or those who had been playing for so long that suddenly even junk strategy started to look good. If you wanted to use Gligar and be competitive though, UU was the tier for you. Its inaugural generation was the first of many that Gligar would spend as an excellent part of the metagame below OU. In UU, Gligar thrived at disrupting the integrity of an opponent's defensive core by using the first of its many switching opportunities to thief something's leftovers away. Afterwards, the lower base stat totals it was surrounded with meant its seemingly shabby attack stat exerted quite a bit of pressure thanks to not only the trustiness of Stab Earthquake, but how nicely complementary its secondary stab Hidden Power Flying was, as it meant grass types like Blossom and Jumpluff that would normally thwart its Earthquakes weren't actually safe switching. Gligar got to pepper the opponent particularly nicely because in addition to its decent damage output, its checks, mostly bulky waters like the Slow Twins, were like most Pokemon in the tier, weak to spikes, while Gligar was among the few in the tier which wasn't. This also made it uniquely good at sticking around to help play around other threats like Pinsir, Nidoqueen, and another spike immune, Scyther. Gligar wasn't a particularly flashy or overwhelming Pokemon, but it was a thoroughly consistent performer that was a key part of many teams' strategy, both offensively and defensively, making it a solid UU staple. Gligar made major strides forward with Gen 3's addition to Swords Dance to its move pool, jolting that seemingly quaint attack stat to threatening levels after a single one of the many turns that it generated. In particular, Gligar excelled at punishing the queen of the tier, Kangaskhan, for using Rest. With Early Bird, it only sleep one turn, but that'd still be a free turn for Gligar to suddenly become capable of slicing through teams that weren't in close to pristine health. Plus, with its good physical bulk, Gligar could afford to tangle with Kangaskhan's own offense, putting it in a thoroughly unique spot as far as attackers were concerned. Gligar generally offered great utility with its fighting resistance and bulk letting it take on the likes of Hitmonlee, and its quick attack providing a crucial option against Gen 3 UU's cavalcade of endure reversal threats like Scyther, as well as substitute Pataya Berry, Manectric, and Electrode. Although it sometimes swapped out quick attack for Iron Tail so as to smash through the Soul Rock that would normally withstand its dual stab. Swords Dance wasn't the only thing it offered either. Choice Band Gligar was a very real threat. After a Swords Dance, Gligar would be scary, but it still needed that turn to Swords Dance, which meant it couldn't quite immediately threaten something like Amistar as much as it would like to, which is why Pokemon like Amistar or Vileplume would be in for a nasty surprise when they stayed in to quell the Swords Dance threat and were instead met with the full brunt of a Banded Earthquake or Hidden Power Flying. It also allowed Gligar to put major pressure on waters like Blastoise switching in, making it an effective wall breaker, and of course still threatened Kangaskhan greatly, with even more immediacy. In fact, letting it punish Kangaskhan trying to dish out a double edge on an assumed Swords Dance. Gligar was a terrific UU Pokemon, but surprisingly, it also wound up seeing some use in OU. Gligar didn't seem to have the stats to hack it in OU, which was mostly true, but what it did have was the ability. Sand Veil is one of the most despised abilities of the permanent Sand generation, which are 3 to 5, and part of what makes it so absurd is how it manages to break not just obviously good Pokemon, but also Pokemon that don't even seem particularly decent. The poster Pokemon for this in Gen 3 OU was Cacturn, which wound up causing quite a stir, and there was some talk of banning Sand Veil. Around this time, some players decided to experiment with Gligar, really pushing the Veil antics, and well, turns out Sand Veil was indeed broken as all get out, because it wasn't long before Gligar was the Ice Beam dodging Pokemon that was driving everyone insane. Cacturn was great and all, but with Swords Dance and a little help from the substitutes that let it fish for misses against anything that wasn't a Dugtrio Aerial Ace that it would shrug off anyway, Gligar was sweeping teams like crazy. All it took was a Magneton to remove Skarmory, and almost nothing else was safe. It seems insane, but giving a free turn to a Swords Dancer, especially one with a speed stat like Gligar's, is one of the worst things you can do. A healthy Swampert can switch in all it likes, but all it takes is one miss and it's toast. One miss gives Gligar more turns of leftovers to create more substitutes to fish for more misses too. It wasn't uncommon to see something switch in to check on an unboosted Gligar, only for Gligar to come out of the exchange with both a Swords Dance boost and an intact substitute. The fact that it had such good defensive typing and physical bulk was also extremely helpful, since you couldn't just threaten to KO it with anything you had. As a result, Gligar diabolically joined forces with Cacturn. Sandvale was banned from Gen 3 OU, capping off a solid sophomore generation for the Pokemon that was soon to be not fully evolved. Gligar's evolution meant the fulfillment of its amazing ground flying typing's potential that it hadn't had the stats to fully take advantage of in the first 2 generations, and now it also has the reliable recovery of Roost. Ground typing is one of the most resilient types in the game, immune to both Sandstorm and Spikes, and in Gen 4 it just got better with a Stealth Rock neutrality and a Toxic Spikes immunity. On top of that, this was the generation that introduced close combat and being resistant to fighting while neutral to Stone Edge, and the newly physical pursuit in addition to the aforementioned Stealth Rock neutrality and Sandstorm immunity made for one of the sturdiest switch-ins in the game, able to stifle both the CC and its common coverage and support that trouble just about every other fighting resist. That's how Gliscor got its start in Diamond and Pearl. Heracross was a terror and Weezing was being used to ward it off, but its lack of a reliable recovery held it back, especially in a Sandstorm. Then Gliscor stepped in and made Weezing disappear completely as perhaps the most perfect Heracross counter in the game, right down to the quadruple effective Flying Stab Aerial Ace if it's so desired, that also helped against another dangerous fighter, Breloom. Fun fact, any team without Gliscor was actually considered Heracross weak. Heracross itself would soon be displaced by the discovery of Swords Dance Lucario, a premier defining sweeper, but for Gliscor nothing changed, as it was the most perfect counter to that as well. This would be one of its defining traits as Platinum came around, but whereas in the early Diamond and Pearl days, its massive defense stat got the most attention, leading to slow, max defense sets akin to other bulky grounds like Swampert and Hippowdon, alternating between the more common Stealth Rock and the occasional Swords Dance, the former also making a worthwhile lead. However, when Platinum came around, Gliscor's game shifted to take advantage of its base 95 speed, which made it unique among bulky grounds and was quite excellent in conjunction with Taunt, making it an even better lead by outspeeding Roserade and mid-game Pokemon when it outsped Heatran. Lead Gliscor also loved using U-Turn, another superb tool in its arsenal for early game positioning and general momentum. However, soon the new standard for Gliscor was established, the Stall Breaker set. With Taunt and Toxic, it was absolutely nightmarish for stall teams, as Toxic immunities would traditionally get threatened by Stab Earthquake, or in the case of Skarmory, completely shut down by Taunt. It was great against seemingly every team, as it maintained its perfect Lucario countering status, was generally difficult to take down, and the few Pokemon that did threaten it, waters like Gyarados and Suicune, had to fear getting Toxic. Stall breaking Gliscor became a defining part of the metagame's semi-stall era, semi-stall being a team style that was basically a faster, more aggressive version of stall, and Gliscor fit in perfectly alongside other staples like Taunt Skarmory, Wish Calm Mind Jirachi, and Choice Scarf Tyranitar. It was so important, in fact, that many top players eventually began using max speed on their Gliscor just to beat other Gliscor. It had no other use, but this was a seriously important matchup. Fun fact, Stall Breaker Gliscor was also referred to as British Gliscor, as British players were key in its popularization, and Britscore, to take another nickname for it, would also often refer to the irritating Sandville misses that would often kick in. One British player whose Gliscor was especially feared for how many misses it incurred on a game-to-game basis, once having lost his Rotom A, switched Gliscor into a weakened Fortress Rapid Spin and dodged it before proceeding to finish Fortress off, thereby creating the meme of Spin Blocker Gliscor. This Gliscor wasn't just used on semi-stall though, it was excellent on bulky offense and full stall as well for its ability to take on such an enormous portion of the metagame well into Heart Gold and Soul Silver, notably running circles against not just stall, but otherwise strong offensive teams that, for all their other strength, only had offensive Suicune to check it. It didn't even have to land the Toxic. Suicune would just get worn down way before Gliscor did. Then after the bans of Latias and Salamence, Breloom exploded in both threat and usage, and it was a great Gliscor switch-in. Sure, Taunt prevented it from using Spore and Substitute, but it shrugged off Earthquake, healed in Sand, and didn't fear Toxic. And while its Seed Bombs weren't immediately threatening, Gliscor couldn't roost against them because by removing its Flying type and becoming Mono Ground, it would become Grass weak. Since Gliscor was one of the better options for taking taking Brelum's hits since it was still a great stall breaker through taunt and roost alone, and Toxic was hardly mandatory for how that slot would occasionally go to U-turn or Stealth Rock anyway. It eventually dropped Toxic in favor of Ice Fang, letting it actually threaten Breloom, as well as giving it a much better answer to Dragonite. Some, especially Loom-threatened answers, even went with Aerial Ace. On the other hand, if you check Breloom elsewhere, you could use Knockoff in that slot, which was incredibly good and made switching around Gliscor even more of a pain, even if you had something like the otherwise perfect blank to it in Leftovers HP Ice Bronzong. Seeing how difficult Breloom was to check, Knockoff Gliscor was harder to fit, but it was well worth the effort. In addition to these move changes, Gliscor, now no longer fighting other Gliscor in crucial taunt Toxic mirrors, went back to an Impish nature, which helped a lot in the Breloom checking department, and with investment, it was still easily fast enough to get the jump on Dragonite, Lucario, and Heatran. Around the same time, players influenced by Gliscor's substitute Swords Dance Sandville antics in Generation 5 decided to try a Gen 4 version of it. Gliscor was already a pain for its random, sometimes game-breaking dodges, even when it wasn't actively fishing for them with its more standard sets, but now that's exactly what it was doing, and it became downright nightmarish, especially as it was so often paired with paralysis support. All it took was one free turn and it'd be poised to sweep your team, and it tended to get more than one free turn, especially because the first free turn gave it extra leftovers to fish for substitutes. This Gliscor's reign of terror was mercifully short-lived, as the odds were actually so much in its favor that its obnoxiousness veered right into broken territory, and the player base was finally spurred into doing what had been yelled about for years, banning Sandvale, as had already been done at that point for years in Gen 5. Amazingly, all this meant for Gliscor's more standard sets was that it had to go with Hyper Cutter, meaning it couldn't randomly cheese misses anymore. And hey, maybe the fact that Gyarados can't intimidate you anymore might help. Seeing how effective sub Swords Dance was even without Sandville though, different types of offensive Swords Dance Gliscor started popping up with a third attack over substitute, and those relished in the Hyper Cutter Intimidate block, letting them cleave through Gyarados with either Thunderfang, which also hit Skarmory, or Stone Edge, which also hit Zapdos, much harder than Ice Fang. When Latias returned, some players even liked Night Slash, which hit defensive Latias and Rotom A, as well as letting Gliscor effectively lure one of its usual switch-ins, Gengar. Gliscor's controversy wasn't just Sandvale though, it was also used for the much maligned Gliscor Pass, a baton pass strategy that set up dual screens with Azelf before sending in an incredibly bulky Yacht Berry Gliscor that was impossible to KO. It would Rock Polish, Swords Dance, and then baton pass to a 4-attack Metagross, which would usually sweep on the spot. You could of course not phase it or trick it or anything of the sort because it had taunt. It took a long time, but eventually the playstyle went from occasional cheese to genuinely overbearing because of how limited its answers were, even when it was being used consistently, and in addition to Gliscor beginning to appear on full baton pass teams, contributed to BP receiving the axe as a whole. Gliscor continued to see experimentation, especially defensive sets were quite good, as were mixed defensive variants. Even physically defensive variants purposely made it as slow as possible as to underspeed Breloom and to be able to roost without becoming weak to its Seed Bomb. Though of course, having such a slow Gliscor brought plenty of issues, so this was rare. There were even the occasional Choice Scarfers, though those didn't really go anywhere. Plus, even its standard taunt variant saw moveset variation. Payback, which doubled damage on the switch in Gen 4, could be used to help stall teams that were weak to Gengar, while also pressuring Starmie, Latias, and Rotom A, while certain teams vulnerable to bulky Swords Dance Scizor opted for Fire Fang, and even bulky sets could sometimes go with Swords Dance over taunt to better force late game wins. Whatever the case, Gliscor was a superb Pokemon, one of DBP OU's best and most important, as if it didn't have enough of an amazing debut generation, Gliscor was also eventually discovered to have quite a decent niche in Ubers, with a specially defensive taunt Toxic set inspired by its use in later generations. It was absolutely ruinous to standard Sunstall, dominating the likes of Groudon, Giratina, Blissey, Cresselia, and Heatran, and was generally a pain for offense with the classic Toxic Earthquake combination in conjunction with its ability to just barely shrug off Draco meters. Its niche was specific but legitimate. Gen 4 UU was far too power crept for Gligar, except for when it appeared to abuse Sandville on extremely gimmicky Hippopotas Sand teams, but given the power of Rain Dance and UU, this was unreliable and rare. Its real home was in NU. Initially, it too abused Sandville there, but that didn't last as Hippopotas wound up being banned. Afterwards, Gligar continued to find, if completely unspectacular, physically defense support Pokemon with U-Turn. As with U-Turn, it generated momentum for hard-hitting teammates, and it was commonly used as a stealth rocker as well, given how sturdily it switched into battle to utilize its many valuable resistances, like Medichamp's Choice Scarf High Jump Kick. It could also become incredibly irritating with Toxic in the Stealth Rock slot, letting it threaten answers like Poliwrath and actually helping it play around Marowak. Gligar was quite good in Gen 4 NU. It was just the kind of generic, unremarkable wall that you would use out of necessity. But this couldn't be said for Gligar in Little Cup, making its competitive competitive debut in the 4th generation. While Munchlax was the undisputed Little Cup king, Gligar came in at a very, very close number 2. It was utterly phenomenal, elite in each and every one of its many thoroughly varied stats. Its stats, thanks to the fact that it was originally designed as a single stat Pokemon, were cut above the rest, and indeed it sparked controversy for potentially being too good in the same vein something like Scyther might, although not to that extreme, more akin to the Murkrow and Mischievous that wound up getting banned as the metagame developed. Gligar was a rarity, not just because it was fast and strong, as you could say the same for something like Elekid, but because in addition to these, Gligar had actual physical bulk, when most fast Little Cup attackers like Staryu tended to fall over when you poke them. Gligar presented a unique challenge, one that was often so taxing to handle, you'd often have to rely on your own Gligar to try and slow it down. Gligar's aforementioned set variety really fueled its dominance. Not only did you have to deal with this Pokemon with nigh perfect typing, beating you through stats, you also had to play some seriously irritating guessing games against it. Thinking that you would threaten the Stealth Rocker out of double switching to your Scarf Snover didn't quite work when it turned out to be Scarf Gligar that stung you with a U-turn. Gligar generally excelled late game, cleaning up even the few non-Scarf Pokemon that outsped it. Of course, even knowing the Gligar set didn't do much to help. The standard Stealth Rock set was astonishingly consistent, since even if you did manage to hit it decently, its Aura and Berry recovery would spring it back up and force you to do it again. Not an easy task against a Pokemon that exerted such pressure on every turn. Finally, Gligar could turn that speed stat that ranked among the tier's best into a different type of late game cleaning with Swords Dance, becoming a monster of a one-hit KO machine that dusted Munchlax, Duskull, and just about anything else that would usually be able to take a hit, like opposing Gligar. Overall, as the tier's second in command, Gligar was one of the most important Pokemon in shaping the first generation of Little Cup to be played competitively. The reaction of every single Gen 4 player was upon the same, seeing the hidden ability Gliscor received from the Dream World. Wait, Gliscor gets Poison Heal? Oh yeah, it was incompatible with Rooster, Stealth Rock, but who cares? Protect had long since worked as recovery for Pokemon like Swampert and Heatran that solely relied on leftovers, and now the famously resilient Gliscor was getting double leftovers recovery while also becoming immune to all status. It was in fact as incredible as it sounded, if not more, with Gliscor immediately establishing itself as one of Gen 5's most important Pokemon. An all-out physically defensive set was one of the few things keeping the tier from utter annihilation by Sandrush Excadrill, while also taking on a slew of other monsters new and old alike, from Terrakion and Conkeldurr to Garchomp and Dragonite, and keeping with the tradition from Gen 4, basically everything, even in a metagame with permanent rain. Incidentally, rain teams tended to enjoy Gliscor much as its old standard sand teams did. While Gliscor became even more of a superb wall by effectively gaining a fire resist, Rainstall especially made great use of its talents. Gliscor was amazing everywhere. On Sun, it lost its water weakness. It still healed in Hail, and when weatherless balances became vogue, you better believe they relied on Gliscor. It wasn't just a physical wall either. Earthquake, Ice Fang, and Protect let it do pretty much all the walling duties it needed, and in the last slot, it slotted Swords Dance, which combined with its incredible longevity to make it an excellent late game sweeper, while also gifting it the ability to go one-on-one with bulky Swords Dance Scizor. Sometimes it uses Facade over Ice Fang, while losing the quad super effective move on Chomp and Dragonite, opposing Gliscor and Landorus Incarnate, or just Landorus at the time, as Ethereans wouldn't be released till Black and White 2, but against single super effective targets like Celebi, Facade actually outdamaged Ice Fang, and more importantly, it was incredibly strong against Gliscor's most common check, Rotom Wash. With Ice Fang, Rotom could switch in repeatedly. With Facade, it could barely switch in at all. Gliscor's moveset also saw variation with Taunt over Protect if the extra physical damage reinforcement wasn't needed, such as if it was paired with Skarmory, for example. It completely turned the tables on Skarmory and sent a lot of common sand teams packing. After Blaziken, Garchomp and Excadrill were banned. Gliscor started its shift towards being used almost exclusively on sand teams and began experimenting with different sets now that it was just a bit less relied on as the tier superglue against just about anything physical. It could now focus on being more of a threat right away rather than waiting for an opportunistic Swords Dance. A Fling acrobatic set had been tried early on but quickly abandoned. Now Gliscor returned to good old toxic spreading with one of the most abominable moves to ever be created, Substitute Toxic Protect, which was indeed as excruciating to face as it sounds and was genuinely as dangerous a threat as any sweeper. It was Volcarona-esque in its ability to single-handedly sweep a team. Nothing delighted it more than seeing Rotom Wash as the opposing team's counter to it. Say goodbye to your 8 Hydro Pumps in a jiffy. There was also the case of Gliscor abandoning Poison Heal for something that was somehow even more devious. Inspired by Garchomp, Gliscor 2 would begin to utilize a substitute Swords Dance Sandville sets that would inspire Gen 4 players some years later. But whereas in Gen 4 it used Leftovers and Ice Fang, here it went for the jugular with Flying Gem Acrobatics, unleashing a brutally powerful secondary stab that, among the many other joys of its great coverage and super earthquake strength, smashed through Rotom Wash despite the resist, as if hitting consecutive Hydro Pumps through Sandville wouldn't already be problem enough. In Black and White 2, this set would actually lead to Sandville getting banned, which also allowed Garchomp and its newly regained Rough Skin to return to OU, but not before some truly insane arguments about Sandville being balanced, including one which insisted that Zoom Lens Slowbro was a perfectly reasonable choice. Anyway, Black and White 2 also saw Poison Heal become compatible with Roost and Stealth Rock, and good old physically defensive Gliscor carried on with Roost where Protect used to be, though Protect was still the move of choice on the sub-Toxic set, which continued to be Gliscor's standard for quite some time. Eventually, influenced by not just X and Y, but Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, as well as a search for an answer to pairing of Spikes and Combine Reuniclus that was destroying the metagame, especially defensive Swords Dance Roost Gliscor began seeing use. It wasn't quite as impenetrable as in Gen 6, what with Permanent Rain, Hidden Power Ice at 70 base power, Ice Beam at 95, and Draco Meter at 140, but while Gliscor didn't shrug these off as easily as it would later on, in a pinch, it was still able to survive them, often to game-breaking effect. It was an outstanding sweeper that could no longer be threatened by your average Scald, and became one of the most defining late-game win conditions of this new era, such as its power that it eventually inspired Combine Reuniclus to start running HP Ice, with the unbanning of Escadrille and its Sand Rush sets being used on Rain Team to counter the Sand Squads Gliscor was used on that would usually be their bane. Good old physically defensive Gliscor made a return, as did Protect as its method of recovery for its greater immediacy, most notably when staring down Air Balloon Excadrill with its new tool Iron Head. Gliscor also started using Stealth Rock on this set where Swords Dance used to be, as Excadrill was so commonly used to Rapid Spin now, and Gliscor could repeatedly come in on it and pop rocks right back up. It started seeing more experimentation with its moveset as well. If Ice Fang wasn't quite so needed to take on Dragonite, Garchomp, Landorus, Therian, and other Gliscor, Knockoff could go in its place, meaning it could still put pressure on opposing bulky Pokemon despite occupying such a dedicated defensive guise itself. Of course, Gliscor itself would be able to stifle this set, and while Gliscor Sand was so reliable, the metagame's defining team style in fact, that there were a lot of Gliscor wars where they PP stalled each other, not wanting anything else on their team to eat a knockoff. Gliscor's utility was immense in helping it occupy a defining place on these defining teams that aim to ignore hazards entirely. While they loved stacking Alakazam and Reuniclus for the double Magic Guard effect, Gliscor was also so impossible to wear down passively that it was often referred to as functionally a Magic Guard Pokemon itself. It cannot be overemphasized how much of a leap Gliscor made in Gen 5 with Poison Heal, how important it was, and it's especially astonishing considering how amazing it was to begin with. Gliscor was even used in Ubers once again, with its excellent sub-toxic set, much like it did in OU. It shut down Groudon even harder than before now, because Poison Heal precluded it from even risking a burn from the rare Lava Plume. Sand teams were superb in Ubers now, as they got to wield Excadrill, and Gliscor was a staple on them, its Groudon stifling ability playing a major role in winning the Weather War. The addition of Eviolite was incredible for Gligar, its physical tanking now able to hang with and stifle much of the power creep in the UU that it returned to. The tier was repeatedly compared to the previous generation of OU, but Eviolite Gligar shut much of it down hard. In a strange mirroring of its evolution early Gen 4 dynamic, Gligar was especially notable for how it completely and utterly countered possibly the scariest threat in the tier, Choice Scarf Heracross, while offering its usual blend of utility moves in return. With how hard it shut down the myriad fighters in the tier, as well as other staples like Scarf Flygon, it consistently darted into battle without its low power ever making it passive thanks to the power of U-Turn. U-Turn was so good that it let Gligar act as a safe answer even to the Swords Dance Heracross that it would otherwise lose to should it not include Aerial Ace, as it normally wouldn't want to. Simply pivot into the Heracross and slow turn out to a faster Revenge Killer. Additionally, though it didn't have Poison Heal, Gligar did have a new ability that let it completely blank Toxic in Immunity, meaning it was even more difficult to wear down. Gligar was a key element of the tier to get an idea of the bulk that it offered a team. It was one of the few neutral Pokemon not completely cooked by Victini's V-Create and Darmanitan's Flare Blitz. As for Little Cuff, oh boy, it wasn't just that Gligar was uncommonly bulky even among the new hit-taking norm of the Eviolite-infested metagame, but the fact that it was an even greater offensive threat than before thanks to the brutal power of Flying Gem Acrobatics, making for a wickedly dangerous sub-Swords Dance threat that plowed through the metagame with absurd ease, not giving a care for everything's newfound Eviolite bulk. It had people scrambling to find answers, resulting in the use of some truly strange Pokemon, perhaps none more than Scarf Shelder, which used its Skill Link Icicle Spears to hit through Gligar's substitutes. Of course, this meant that you were stuck using Scarf Shelder, which was otherwise terrible. Gligar wasn't just substitute Swords Dance either, as its Eviolite tanking abilities were on full display with more support-oriented sets, which were excellent as well. But Acrogar, as it was called, was overbearing, and it's a set that wound up getting it the ban hammer fairly early into Black and White 1. Then in Black and White 2, Gligar was unbanned and was immediately sent packing once again, really cementing its place in Little Cup history. With Gen 6's major buff to knockoff, meaning the move was now everywhere, Gliscor became one of the best absorbers of the move once its Toxic Orb had already activated. It was especially important since it doubled as an answer to the newly dangerous Bisharp. XY is where especially defensive Gliscor first took off, retroactively inspiring its use in Gen 5. The primary reason was Aegislash, which was terrorizing pretty much everything else, and had even started using Subtoxic that ruined the otherwise perfect answer that was specially defensive Hippowdon. Gliscor was of course completely unfazed and also walled Landorus Incarnate, which was not using HP Ice early in the gen since the move had been weakened and it was too busy delighting in the rest of its move pool. Aegislash was eventually banned, and Landorus Incarnate eventually started running HP Ice again, pretty much solely for Gliscor. But the specially defensive set was here to stay, as players realized just how ridiculously difficult it was to KO now that the base powers of moves had been toned down. In addition to the super effective hits aimed at it, moves like Fire Blast and Hurricane positively bounced off. It was the new standard. In Gen 6, the Taunt knockoff set was popular as it was ruinous to stall teams. Then Oraz came around and Taunt was replaced by Swords Dance, which became the go-to on Gliscor's de facto team style. Spiked balances that the player base had realized were so great since Gen 6's defog buff actually turned out to do very little to stop the spikers. This meant that there were many Gliscor wars, prompting knockoff to eventually be replaced by Facade and even Ice Fang. Getting the edge on opposing Gliscor was huge. This became one of the most defining dynamics of the generation, not just that Gliscor often faced off against itself, but that the power of the special defense SD set was such that it wound up warping the entire tier around it. It seemed to beat, well, everything. How did this work? It's not that bulky. The truth is, even the best Oraz players were often at a loss to explain how Gliscor did it. But what they did know is that Gliscor was doing it over and over and over. It made no sense with how with Roost, it regularly outstalled all manner of hidden power ices and ice beams and all manner of special attacks. Players were absolutely flummoxed. They'd go out of their way to throw ice coverage on half their team, and Gliscor would sweep them anyway. Countering it seemed impossible. How many more ice moves can you possibly throw at this thing? While we're at it, it's not just ice. Aren't there plenty of waters running around? Keldeo and Rotom Wash and Slowbro chief among them? Well, Gliscor would outlast Keldeo, which didn't switch in safely, and Rotom Wash quite regularly saw its Hydro Pump PP outstalled. Even though its base power had been lowered to 110, this was still a particularly stupefying feat. As for Slowbro, which should theoretically be one of the best Gliscor answers, well, it generally was, but there were times where Gliscor would make its way through it anyway, just like it was seen beating Tangrowth, even though that had super effective stabbed Giga Drain to use when it roosted and became a ground type. It was one of the mysteries of the universe that prompted another wave of teams that stacked their own hazards while ignoring the opponents, letting Gliscor and its new partner Combine Clefable, another Pokemon whose ice beams Gliscor tended to shrug off, by the way, effortlessly go the distance. While the metagame eventually moved in a more hyper-offensive direction, this didn't mean Gliscor Spikes was left behind. No, it was one of the most eternal facts of the Pokemon world. In addition to its old standard thriving, Gliscor experimented plenty. Its classic SD setup was so good, you could use just about anything on it. Sometimes you saw Rock Slide, letting it leverage its special bulk to check Volcarona, and in a pinch, even Mega Charizard Y. At one point, SD U-Turn was being used, a seemingly contradictory combination previously thought to only be pulled off by Scizor and Mega Scizor and their stab on U-Turn, but nope. As it turns out, even Earthquake wound up not being mandatory on Swords Dance Gliscor. Unbelievable though that sounds. At one point, tournament players were witnessing Taunt Swords Dance Facade Roost not only get used, but win serious games. What do you need EQ for when most normal resists will fall to repeated facades, especially when Gliscor is so famously good at getting multiple Swords Dance boosts? And of course, you can't heal the damage off because it will taunt you instead. It absolutely ruins Stall, with even unaware Quagsire hapless against it, and was ferocious against opposing balance instead. Some teams even stepped away from Swords Dance entirely, instead utilizing Gliscor's incredible longevity as a stealth rocker that would repeatedly switch into the tier's #1 spinner, and Pokemon overall, Excadrill, unafraid of Toxic, as Landorus Therian might be, and able to check Bisharp as well for that matter. Somehow, Gen 6 Gliscor had completely matched its elite status from Gen 5. Gliscor was also quite good in XY Ubers. As always, its taunt antics made it a stall ruiner extraordinaire. Plus, with Groudon Sun no longer being permanent, Gliscor would actually switch into Ho-Oh's Sacred Fire without risking a burn, which was an excellent defensive niche and a major advantage over Arceus ground. Gliscor was also a solid check to Zekrom, and as always, Groudon, for how easily it hit the field. It was also commonly used as a stealth rocker. Its longevity aside, Toxic letting it outlast defog Arceus forms beautifully. It was even a nice backup against E-Killer Arceus. This place in Ubers didn't last into the high-powered Primal Groudon and Mega Salamence-led Auraz metagame, but before that, Gliscor was a genuinely great part of the metagame. Gligar returned to UU in Generation 6. It had to be wary of losing its Eviolite now that Knockoff had been buffed, but its support capabilities were tremendous once again, letting it dance around everything from Mega Aerodactyl, Cobalion to Infernape, often using a good deal of special defense investment to make it deceptively difficult to take out on its weaker defensive stat. It could thus easily stay in and roost off Scarf Hydreigon's Draco Meteor or help pivot around Nasty Plot Celebi with U-Turn. In addition to Stealth Rock, Gligar could now provide even more support with the defog buff, though thanks to compatibility issues, it wouldn't be able to use Immunity as its ability, which it loved using on its Stealth Rock set. Still a worthwhile price to pay in order to have some semblance of stability in the perpetual crisis that was the war on entry hazards and the thoroughly thankless task of removing them. Gligar was a great UU Pokemon once again, and it was also too much for Little Cup once again. The gem removal meant that Aquagar was no longer the terror it had previously been, but Swords Dance sets were still peerless in their menace. It wasn't just Swords Dance either. Gligar was so good against everything, it took on this sort of Landorus Therian-esque role of being so good you could find a place for it on just about any team, which is exactly what people did. Gligar's usage was astronomical, breaking the 40% mark. This is roughly 10% more than Gen 4 OU Scizor at its peak, and the players there complained that Scizor was too popular, which is exactly what happened here with Gligar. Several Little Cup players stepped away from the tier, and others were dissuaded from getting into it because it wound up feeling like Gligar the tier. It was so often optimal to use Gligar on your team and to use your Gligar against the opponent's Gligar. Not the healthiest dynamic, especially since Gligar's offensive and defensive power just overshadowed everything. It was a top tier fast, strong sweeper that also packed bulk better than Ferroseed. It didn't even need Eviolite, instead going with the incredible health reinforcement of Berry Juice. You didn't exactly have the luxury of getting to hit Gligar hard multiple times while it was in the process of mowing you down. As a result, Gligar was banned from Little Cup once more, and in fact it was so dominant here that the Little Cup player base wound up choosing to never allow it to return to the tier again. Gligar had officially achieved Little Cup royalty. Gliscor started Gen 7 off in UU, where it was exactly as amazing as such an idea would sound, especially since it was going up against many familiar faces like Scizor and Latias. Gliscor was incredibly easy to slap on a team and basically dominate dangerously close to the entire tier, and how it both stifled so much offense and threatened so much of its own in return with its usual bag of tricks. It ruined the otherwise excellent stall playstyle with Taunt. It threatened the Toxic Earthquake combination on anything that wasn't an opposing Gliscor. It stealth rocked, it defogged, and of course its Swords Dance sets were brutal. Sets plural, because Gliscor had plenty of variety to its game. In addition to the usual covers like Facade or Ice Fang, it could also go for a more offensive EV spread alongside Rock Polish, the dual boost letting it choose whether it needed to jet pass offense or break down defense depending on the matchup. In addition to its usual physical or especially defensive spreads, the latter being particularly excruciating to deal with since even its one supposed weak spot couldn't even really be targeted anymore. It shrug off Mega Manetrix HP Ice and Latias' Z Draco Meteor all the same. Neither of these moves even came close to KOing it, even with Stealth Rock, though of course one of Gliscor's great strengths was being Stealth Rock neutral, yet shrugging off the damage with merely one of Poison Hill recovery, meaning you couldn't rack up rocks against it with double switches that immediately forced it out. Gliscor just kept getting scarier in UU too, as several bans only served to remove some of the few elements that were actually okay at reliably threatening it. Drizzle was the biggest, with Azumarill and Thunderous Incarnate's ban assisting as well. At this point, Gliscor was overwhelming, considered one of the tier's very most elite Pokemon, with clamors for its ban heard throughout the land. UU would be spared with this process though, as Gliscor rose to OU through usage, doing well exactly what it had done in Auraz. Especially defensive Swords Dance was once again completely taking over the metagame, which was especially baffling given that not only was it not long before everyone was once again lobbing all the ice coverage they could muster at it, to no avail of course, but the major power creep in general, both in terms of Pokemon and the threat of Z-moves flying around every corner. It didn't matter, the same core dynamic was there, which is that Gliscor switched in with ease, and the harder hitting Pokemon struggled to switch in and go the distance against it, while the more defensive Pokemon got the usual SD Roost treatment. Gliscor was also an excellent stealth rocker and occasional defogger on certain teams. Its fast stealth rock toxic set was actually one of the most reliable answers to subcoil Zygarde, since if Zygarde subbed on the switch, Gliscor would have a few attack EVs invested so it could break the sub before threatening the toxic, which also let it threaten Tornadus and Rotom Wash trying to defog against it. After Zygarde's ban, Gliscor would experiment with U-turn in the slot to superb results. However, Swords Dance was what most defined it. It really was Gliscor's metagame. What was particularly insane was that its peak in Gen 7 was taking place simultaneously alongside the one in Gen 6, and of course in 5 it was everywhere as well. No matter which of these 3 gens you were playing, you were both using and fearing Gliscor. It helped that in Gen 7, Gliscor was arguably the most consistent answer to the utterly terrifying Z Heatran, surviving even Infernal Overdrive, then outspeeding and roosting the damage off, now walling it. Once again, Gliscor was just extraordinary. Gligar excelled in RU in early Gen 7, pulling its usual blend of utility tricks effortlessly against the likes of Zygarde 10% and Registeel, but that was only because there was no reason to use it in UU when Gliscor was around. Eventually though, when Gliscor left UU for OU, Gligar wound up replacing it and wound up rising from RU to UU through usage. It wasn't a literal Gliscor replacement in that it wouldn't be pulling off brilliant Swords Dance sweeps anytime soon, but what it did do was offer superb bulk, letting it take on newly added monsters like Terrakion and increase utility now that defog and immunity were compatible. As a result, Gligar became a fixture on stall teams, easily able to shut down common rockers like Mega Aggron and Cobalion. When paired with a second defogger, most infamously the Empoleon thwarting Pressure Heal Bell Articuno, it became incredibly easy for stall to pretty much permanently deny opposing Stealth Rock, which made breaking through the walling core of Blissey, Quagsire, and Alomomola, already famed for their longevity, go from difficult to borderline impossible, especially since Alomomola so freely being able to switch in let it pass its gigantic wishes to its teammates and reinforce their quasi-immortality as well. Gligar wasn't just useful on stall, of course. It was solid for the backbone turned into U-turn momentum strategy prized by bulky offense and balanced teams as well. It was, however, at its most devilishly notorious as an integral part of the stall machine, whose power was so suffocating it drove the UU player base insane as they searched for increasingly specific solutions only to repeatedly lose to the style anyway, making it a source of controversy for many years and eventually culminating in tearing action. After debates on Blissey and Unaware, it was actually Quagsire that took the fall for the style, and it worked. Stall was still a solid style afterwards, with Gligar as effective as ever. It just wasn't as broken as it had been before, and so Gligar wound up becoming more common on different playstyles as a result. For a not fully evolved Pokemon to still be UU as late as Gen 7 was really amazing, and for it to be so good as to fuel a broken playstyle, well, that was just incredible. People were afraid that Gliscor would need a ban should it be released in Gen 8, as it would seem completely unstoppable with hidden power no longer in the game, meaning it would absolutely blank most electric types and, well, even more Pokemon than it already had. The removal of Z-moves bringing the power level down sure didn't help. It was never released in Gen 8, but as soon as it arrived in the Teal Mask DLC, it fulfilled that promise of brokenness and then some, in spite of some truly astonishing power creep, especially because now it got both spikes and toxic spikes as if it weren't synonymous with the hazard game enough already. This just really amped up that whole dynamic where Gliscor was the only thing that safely switches into Gliscor, as pretty much nothing else is switching into the likes of Spikes, Knockoff, and Toxic. It was already famous for messing with hazard removal with both Toxic and Taunt, but now with Gen 8 Spin and Defog blocking Goldango, it had an even easier time keeping its hazards up, thus becoming one of the most foremost contributors to the Spike-littered Gen 9, and as always, one of the best answers to Spikes being all over the place. Once again, Gliscor warped the tier, though for different reasons this time, but whereas it had been a controversial presence for several generations now, here it was absolutely despised. The outcry against it was immediate, sustained, and vicious, which resulted in a suspect test, and for the first time ever, Gliscor was banned from OU, an honest-to-goodness Uber. Gen 4 fans everywhere wept with pride and joy. Power creep who? Gliscor returned to OU with the expanded Pokedex of the Indigo Disc DLC, but it once again openly defied power creep, stirring up another round of protests against it. It still spiked all over the place, of course, but what was particularly terrifying now was the exploration of its classic Swords Dance sets, given the new possibilities of a terastallizing twist, as if it needed any more help, being both offensively and defensively dangerous. But yep, Terra did just that, managing to propel SD Gliscor even further into the stratospheric heights. Terra Normal was particularly bonkers for how its superpowered facade while removing Gliscor's weaknesses. Have fun with your hapless Ice Spinner Great Tusk as Gliscor smashes it into oblivion. That's a fairly tame example too, new. Nothing quite like Gliscor breaking Kyurem. Oh, and ground stab isn't needed. Facade was often paired with knockoff, meaning that the air balloon Goldengo that would blank the Earthquake Facade duo got destroyed. Of course, classic EQ Facade was still a monster. That Goldengo balloon better be preserved at all costs, which was easier said than done, and you had to perfectly tread that line lest you buy yourself a one-way ticket for the express train to a Gliscor sweep. Most teams slower than all-out offense were ruined by Gliscor, both overpowered by it and unable to threaten it with damage. And of course, offense didn't exactly have an easy time either, especially since Gliscor had so many different ways to EV itself. Good old special defense was once again elite, shrugging off even the monstrous special attacks of Raging Bolt. Physically defensive was a force as well, letting it take on the mighty King Gambit. Alternatively, Gliscor could bypass the need to take hits in the first place by going with a jolly nature, which placed it well ahead of several significant threats, getting the jump on Hisuian Samurott, Dragonite, Landorus Therian, and the aforementioned Great Tuscan Raging Bolt was major. All this while it was still spiking to its heart's delight. Anti-Gliscor sentiment reached a fever pitch. Yes, it was more manageable now, but that didn't necessarily mean it was manageable overall, at least not within reason. And so, Gliscor received a second suspect test. This time it managed to avoid the ban and continues to thrive as one of OU's most elite Pokemon today. Though still, those who are not exactly pleased with its presence in the tier. The new and improved Gliscor returned to Ubers even before it was briefly sent there from OU. It had already long since been used for its own merits, which were numerous and excellent. Its classic typing was wonderful as always, alongside max defense, letting it absorb Ho-Oh's Sacred Fire, which was superb as an opportunity to let it stack spikes, while it also assisted its teammates against monsters like Koraidon, Zacian Crown, and Dragon Dance Arceus Ground. It wasn't immovable for them, but as a check, it was very, very good. It also could opt for a specially defensive set to help soft check Heavy Duty Boots Miraidon before its ban, while also being able to play the Hazard War of Attrition more efficiently against Eternatus and support Arceus forms. Gen 9 Gliscor was easily its greatest guys yet. Gligar finally dipped below UU in Gen 9. Unlike Gliscor and its Poison Heal field recovery through Protect, Gligar had no such mechanism, not even leftover since it so badly needed Eviolite, and thus using it was much less appealing. It didn't help that Power Creep was doing its best to break all previous barriers of absurdity, and even still, Gligar managed to have the slightest of niches through being able to lay spikes. It wasn't actually particularly worthwhile though, and wound up dropping all the way down to NU, but on the way, it actually found itself a decent place in RU for how it was able to temporarily stave off familiar faces like Terrakion, as well as how it turned defensive staples like Umbreon and Hippowdon into prime hazard-laying territory. RU Gligar wasn't the most impactful Pokemon, but it had its uses. Take some hits, lay some hazards, basically stave off opposing threats long enough to lay the groundwork for its teammates to clean up later on. You could wish past it to try and compensate for the lack of recovery, but it wasn't quite so tanky or impactful that this was worth some sort of extra effort. Gligar was best on hard-hitting offensive teams, as if it were on a slower balanced team, it would stick out like a sore thumb for its complete lack of longevity, which make not just itself but its teammates easier to break through via the opportunities that it would hand the opponent. Gligar was definitely at its best in NU, where the lower power level meant it was much better at switching in despite its lack of healing. It took on staples like Overqwil and familiar faces such as Heracross and Flygon with aplomb, and left the field littered with spikes in return. Through its bulk, Gligar also received more opportunities with which it could spam knockoff, which threatened opposing heavy duty boots and thus made its own hazards more effective. It had a lower ceiling thanks to the lack of recovery, meaning there was a severe timer, a limited window in which it could hit the field and lay the groundwork for its teammates. But if its team was good and its users skilled, Gligar could be tremendously helpful and effective. And as for VGC, Gliscor is not good. Its amazing longevity and passivity doesn't work well versus two Pokemon at once, and it needs a lot of heavy lifting to make work. Also, Lando T and its Intimidate is just way better. Its only placements include the Juniors division of the 2013 Australian Nationals, where two players named Peter and Blake got 3rd and 4th place respectively with Gliscor. Then Wolfie Glick placed 25th at Worlds 2013, but by his own admission, Gliscor is on the worst Pokemon team that he's ever built. Then in Gen 6, a player got 7th with Gliscor at the Perth region, though not much info is known about this Gliscor. Gliscor then saw a few placements in Gen 9, but none of them broke even a top 32 at a regional. And with that, Gliscor joins Toxapex, Skarmory, and many other amazing defensive singles Pokemon that are bad in doubles. So now we can answer the question, how great were Gligar and Gliscor actually? Well, Gliscor was extraordinary, an eternal OU staple, beyond that time in Gen 7 where it was UU, and predictably shaped the entire tier around it before rising back to OU through usage, as the player base had realized just how superb it was. It warped metagame after metagame around it, defying ice moves en masse in a truly mystifying phenomenon. And that was before Gen 9 came around to remove Hidden Power Ice and give it terrestrialization alongside Spikes and T-Spikes, resulting in Gliscor actually getting banned from OU, then unbanned and almost banned a second time. It had great roles in Ubers too, but it doesn't really have a VGC career to speak of, but with a singles resume like this, that's more than fair. Gliscor is one of the greatest competitive singles Pokemon of all time. As for Gligar, it had an unusual career that goes as far back as Gen 2 UU, and in fact, it spent nearly all of its career in UU, which is kind of miraculous given its low stats. Gens 2 and 3 it was great, with a hilariously broken foray into OU, where it drove players insane with Sandville. Then it dipped to NU in Gen 4, where it was solid, but Gen 5 gave it Eviolite, and it became one of the item's best users, launching itself to UU proper in Gens 5, 6, and 7. Given that it has the slightest of niches in Gen 9 UU, even though Roost was taken away from it, one wonders if it would have managed to maintain that streak otherwise. Though having gained spikes, it found itself still, in spite of no recovery, rocking solid rows in RU, and especially NU. Alongside its mostly UU adventures, Gligar also established itself as one of the best Little Cup Pokemon, starting with a clear number 2 rank right behind Munchlax in the inaugural Little Cup generation, Gen 4, then launching the Super Stardom in Black and White, where it was banned twice, then again in Gen 6, after being so dominant as to shape the metagame in its image, and making the player base decide it would never be allowed in Little Cup again, becoming one of the vaunted Little Cup Ubers alongside the famous Scyther. Gligar had an amazing competitive career in its own right, despite its low stats and not fully evolved status. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.